guys, welcome back to the real Mr.Beer. My name is Josh Ratliff. I'm a BJCP certified beer judge. I'm the brewmaster for Mr.Beer, and I am a store manager for everything homebrew here in Tucson, Arizona. Today we're going to be brewing a Mr.Beer cider kit, and I'm also going to be talking about how you can hack this or make it a lot better. I mean, it's good on its own, but there's a lot of different ways you can make it your own. I'm also going to be talking about doing intermediate cider and advanced cider. So think of it just like brewing. In brewing, you'll have your hopped malt extract kits or your extract kits, which in this case would be like our cider kits. And then intermediate, which would be like, a partial mash. That would be kind of like using our cider kits with some extra apples or some apple juice. And then advanced would be using just straight from apples themselves. So we're going to go over all of that today, but we're going to brew our apple cider kit. So to get started on this, the first thing I want to point out, if you guys are familiar with our cider kits, or if you've bought them in the past but you haven't in a long time, you might notice there's one extra bottle now. There used to only be two, but now there are 3 bottles of apple concentrate. We did some testing a couple years ago on these, and through customer feedback and our own testing here at Mr.Beer, we found that adding the extra bottle gave it just a little bit more flavor. It seemed to be a little thin before, so that extra bottle beefed it up. Of course, brought the cost up just a couple bucks, but it's definitely worth it, so you're not drinking thin cider. So these cider kits include the 3 bottles, no rinse cleanser, and a Safale SO4 yeast, and I'll go over yeast selection in cider as well as the show goes on. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, got my pot here, I'm going to add 4 cups of water, and this is going to be just like the Mr.Beer kits, pretty much same exact instructions. All right, 4 cups of water. We're going to want to bring this to a boil. You typically want to use a smaller pot for this so it doesn't evaporate your water out too fast. But I only have this one available today, unfortunately. So you'll want to let this come to a boil, then remove it from the heat, add your apple juice. Just like malt extract, if you leave this in the heat too long, it will darken a bit. It will oxidize because heat promotes oxidation. And you've seen apples turn brown really fast in the oxygen, so same thing. So the recipe on this calls for 1.5 cups of granulated sugar. I'm going to be doing brown sugar today, just because I like to have a little bit more of that kind of brown sugar flavor in the cider. There's all kinds of things you can add to your cider kit. I mean, the sky's really the limit, just like the beer. You can add like vanilla extract, you can use honey in there, maple syrup, fruit. You can add some berries. We do have a bunch of cider recipes on our website that do have like berries and some spices. We do have an uncarbonated hot mulled cider on our website. It's really good for the holidays. You can also add hops. Hopped ciders are starting to become kind of common. And I really like them. I just discovered them a few years ago, and I don't know why it was just a few years ago I discovered them. I should have been drinking them for years. But that extra bit of hops, and it's not hop bitterness like in beer, it's the hop flavor. So you know how you can get tropical flavors, citrus flavors, piney flavors. These can complement a cider very well too. You can also add some malt extract to your cider. I do a recipe basically an apple pie cider. So it uses some kind of pie spices, but I also add a little bit of malt extract, typically like the pale or golden LME, which you can do. And that will boost your alcohol a little bit, but it also adds a little bit of body and a little bit of malty note. So that kind of takes the place of the crust of the pie, if you can kind of imagine that. A little bit of vanilla, some cinnamon stick. It's really good. Now once you go a certain percentage of malt extract into your cider, say you get up to about 50% malt extract, 50% cider, you're basically making a beer cider hybrid called a graf, G-R-A-F. And those were kind of ancient style drinks that are also, they're not that popular today, but you can find a few examples on the market. We do have 1 or 2 recipes on our website, Graph Recipes. So the yeast, again, this comes with the SO4. It's an English ale yeast. It can be pretty clean, but it can give kind of some bready notes, a little bit of yeasty notes, which for apple cider it can be really good, give you kind of a traditional flavor. But you can also use different yeast if you like. You can use the Safale SO5, which is the pink packet, the Chico strain. That's the American strain. It's gonna be very, very clean, and that'll give you a more crisp, forward apple flavor. You can also experiment with things like Belgian yeast. There's a cidery called Crispin that does a cider called the Saint, and it's an apple cider brewed with honey and Belgian ale yeast. And the Belgian ale yeast imparts these kind of bubblegum esters and fruity esters, a little bit of banana notes. That beer was incredible, so I tried to replicate it a couple years ago, and it came out pretty good. So yeah, you can experiment with Belgian yeast. You can do a wheat yeast to get more of those the banana, which is isoamyl acetate, that ester, and some of the clove. You can also sour your ciders, which is another thing that's starting to become more popular these days. People are adding lactobacillus, pediococcus to sour their ciders. They're making Brettanomyces ciders. I had one from France a few months ago that was really, really good. It had this kind of saison-like note to it, which was really weird for a cider, but it was so good. And then there's barrel-aged ciders, which are also becoming very popular. And then, of course, sour barrel-aged ciders. So people are going pretty crazy with ciders. In fact, hard ciders are one of the fastest growing markets in the beverage industry right now. Domestically, I think this says they rose about 264% between 2005 and 2012 for domestic sales in the U.S. of cider. Before, they were mostly popular in England, and Americans just kind of scoffed at it and drank the beer. But now the industry revenue's up by hundreds of millions, and these Americans who were once skeptical of this cider are now drinking it by the gallons. And of course, cider did make kind of a drop in 2015 in profits. That was mainly the big companies like Anheuser-Busch and Strongbow, some of those bigger cider companies. But local and regional cideries took off after 2015, and they still are growing. And that should sound familiar to you, because that's exactly how the beer market is going too. These bigger companies are losing a little bit of the market share. They're losing annual profit sales, while all of these smaller breweries and smaller cideries are starting to get a lot more of that, see a lot more of that money in their pockets. So it looks like we're at a boil. I'm gonna go ahead and turn this off. And just start adding our extract. And there's always a lot left behind in the bottles, so I just take a little bit of water and shake them up. Fill it to about 1/8 or 1/4 or so, just a little bit. Okay. Hey, how's it going, Mini Yoda? You don't know me? Cortain? Thank you for those beers, by the way, Yoda. We really enjoyed them. Yoda sent us some beers from Kentucky that were all pretty damn good. I was really impressed. Yeah, Yoda, you can, it's going to be a little different though. You have a little bit more leeway with fruit. You can put like straight citrus fruit into a cider and it would taste good. Might be a little too citric for a beer, but a cider, or too acidic for a beer, but for a cider it would work just fine, I think. But yeah, you can use zest, But yeah, as far as fruit goes, you're going to have to pasteurize your fruit before you use it, or use canned, which is typically already sanitized. And we do sell all kinds of canned fruit on our website. And it's from Oregon Fruits, which is really, really great fruit. They also make really large cans for like making wines or large batches. All right. Okay, I probably should have added my brown sugar first to let it dissolve, but this is still pretty hot, so it should dissolve just fine. Trusty whisk. And that's going to be 1.5 cups, roughly. So it'll be 3 of these because these are half-cup scoops. And you can use more or less. I mean, this is really just going to boost your alcohol. One thing you can do, instead of adding 1 gallon of cold water to your fermenter, add 1 gallon of apple juice, and that'll give you a lot of extra body, a lot of extra flavor, and you can even omit the sugar altogether because that'll have enough sugar in it for your fermentation. So that's another way you can do it. You can even use all apple juice instead of water at all, and still use the concentrates and have a really nice full-bodied cider. Donomi says, first cider I had was Angry Orchard. It was disgusting, but then I went to Stowe, Vermont, and was blown away by how good they can be. Yeah, some of those really sweet American ciders are just a little too sickly sweet. There are a few good ones. Even Angry Orchard has a couple good ones. They do have a dry English style cider that's not too bad. Woodchuck Ciders up in Vermont as well. They make some pretty good ciders. Of course, all these are kind of more sweeter American styles. But the best cideries that I found is Finn River in Washington and Argus Cidery. I think they're in Texas. But both of those are incredible cideries. But Finn River is not cheap. When I used to live in Washington and was working at a home brew store, cider making was really big, as you can imagine, with the Washington apples and everything. So that's all dissolved. So, I mean, we used to even have, our store had a crusher and a press that we would rent out. And we'd have it rented out a lot. There'd be a waiting list for it. So during harvest season, cider making was our big cash profit for our homebrew store up there in Washington. Okay, so get my barrel. Now this has already been pre-sanitized. I mean, Tim goes over all the sanitizing thing on our beginning shows, so I didn't feel like we really needed to go over that because of the content I have to talk about today. So we're going to go ahead and move this so that we can make use of the camera still. Give it a little extra spray of Star San here. Okay, first I'm going to put some cold water. So as usual, you want to use cold water, or in this case, if you want, like I said, you can use apple juice instead, which is totally fine. Just be sure it is a pasteurized apple juice and not an unpasteurized raw apple juice, because that could have bacteria, wild yeast, mold spores, and other contaminants. So that'll be up to the number 1 mark. Well, on our cider barrels, it's still the 4 quart or 4 liter, and then the 8.5 quart mark. And it does look pretty dark now and concentrated, but as those sugars get fermented out, it should lighten up just a little bit. Alright, and I'll go ahead and top this off to the 8.5 mark. These ciders will be about 4% alcohol or so when made this way. Again, you can add, if you omit the sugar and add a gallon of apple juice, I found it comes up to about 5.5%. If you use the apple juice and the sugar, goes up to closer to about 6 to 6.5%. If you use all apple juice, you can be looking at 7-8% hard cider there. And again, when you're getting up that high in alcohol with all of those kind of fermentables, you want to keep an eye on it. Probably not so much with cider, because cider doesn't have a krausen as much, but that can change depending on the types of ingredients you have in there. The cider does not have gluten, so it is gluten-free for people with celiac. And because it doesn't have gluten in it, there's not going to be a big krausen or a lot of foam over. But again, if you're adding hops or if you do add a little bit of malt extract, it could boil over a bit. Corthane says, problem I have had with using store apple juice is either preservatives in the cider or bacteria from the apple skins. So I'll try pressing my own apple juice. Yeah, you can typically, if you can get a pasteurized, most pasteurized apple juices or apple ciders in the market don't have preservatives. But the more like, you know, Tropicana or you know, Treetop, those a lot of those can have things like potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, and these do prevent the yeast from fermenting. It can kill them off and prevent them from reproducing and fermenting. So you want to try to stay away from those. So always read the ingredients on the apple juice and make sure it's just apple juice and it's been pasteurized. If you go to like, you know, usually, you know, the more high-end kind of health food stores like Whole Foods, they'll have the apple juices in the glass jars. Those are typically pasteurized and pretty good quality apple juice. Do the off flavors, Minion asked, do the off flavors created by fermenting beer to warm or not conditioning long enough also occur when making cider? Also, is acetaldehyde wrong for a cider? They do occur, but they're not as noticeable. As for example, acetaldehyde gives you a green apple kind of flavor. Now you're making apple cider, so I mean, even if you could taste it, they kind of go hand in hand anyway. So it's not going to be as big of an issue. Beers are going to be a little bit, they have a little bit more issues with stability because they're a little more complex in their types of long chain sugars and carbohydrates and proteins, whereas cider is pretty much just juice, you know, fructose and you know, maybe a little pectin, but that's about it. So it's not going to be nearly as you know, you're not going to get nearly as bad off flavors. But with that said, I would still stick with those rules that you use for beer when making cider to keep it as clean and tasting as possible. Gordweave 4 says, can this clear keg be used for beer? Yes, indeed it can. A fermenter is a fermenter. All you need to ferment is a container. It is clear, so you want to keep it out of direct sunlight. Usually indoor lighting is not going to hurt it. It doesn't have enough UV rays to harm it. I mean, if you look behind me, you know, we have the clear glass growlers and carboys and such that we do secondaries in. So you can totally do it in it. You just want to keep it out of direct sunlight. I know some of our brewers prefer using the clear keg for their beer because they can actually see the activity a lot easier. But But yeah, absolutely you can. All right, so I want to get into a little bit about, well, let me add this yeast here first and get this top on so I'm not leaving it exposed for too long. Scissors. I want to sanitize everything. Okay. All right. Okay, now, in 3 weeks, I'm going to be kegging this cider instead of bottling it, and I'll tell you why. If you want to make a sweet cider like the Angry Orchard sweeter ones, or if you're really into those, or like the Strong Hammer, I think it's called, the ones that are done by Miller or whatever. It's kind of difficult to make an American sweet cider. Our ciders are going to be dry, very dry, English style. The reason for this is because the yeast will ferment any sugar you add. So the only way to stop the yeast from fermenting that sugar you're adding for sweetness is to kill the yeast. But if you kill the yeast, then you can't carbonate it because they need sugar to carbonate. So there are a couple ways to get around this. The first way, which is the easiest, but well, I wouldn't even say it's the easiest, but it's going to be the most approachable for a home brewer, the cheapest, I guess. Basically, it would be you would bottle your beer, add the sugar for sweetness, carbonate it for about 5 or 6 days, but you'll have to keep an eye on it. And that's why I recommend, if you're doing this, to use our plastic PET bottles so you can squeeze the bottles and you can tell if they're going to be carbonated or not. What might even be better is to order some of our root beer bottles that have the caps with the gaskets on them. That way it doesn't explode. So you need to make sure they're not going to ferment all that sugar you added. You want to refrigerate it as soon as it's carbonated to the level you want, and then the refrigeration is going to make that yeast go dormant so they don't continue eating that sugar. You'll have to keep it refrigerated, till you consume it. Otherwise the yeast is going to wake up and start consuming that sugar again. So this is not a very efficient way to do it because of the fact that the yeast is eating some of that sugar. That might take away some of your sweetness. Some of the bottles may be uneven, some may be sweeter than others due to the amount of yeast or amount of sugar that is in the bottle. So it's not a very reliable way to make a sweeter cider. So the best way to do it is by kegging your cider. And when you're kegging your cider, you're always kegging at cold temperatures, so the yeast is going to be dormant, and you don't have to depend on the yeast to ferment the sugar to create your CO2. Instead, you put your cider in your keg, purge it, put it at cold temperatures. And if you want to know more about kegging, we did a kegging video that should be up on our videos section above. And you can kind of go through that, and it'll apply exactly to cider as well. So you're going to keg your cider, refrigerate it, and then carbonate it. Well, then you can add your sugar to it, however much sugar you want, and then carbonate it to the level you want. And so the yeast is going to be asleep because that whole process is at cold temperatures. Now, if you want to bottle some of that cider from your keg, and you want to have that at room temperature, or if you have it in your keg and you want to age it at room temperature, I've made ciders where I've added oak chips into my keg and let it sit at room temperature for a few weeks to a few months. What you need to do to prevent that yeast from coming back alive is to add potassium sorbate. This is something that usually comes with a lot of wine kits because they use it to kill the yeast so that you can then degas the wine and make it really smooth. But you can get it at most homebrew supply stores. You can get it here at my homebrew supply store. We don't sell it on Mr.Beer right now because it hasn't been, it's not really anything that is used with our kits per se. But potassium sorbate and potassium metabisulfate, these are two ingredients that you can use by themselves or together. I prefer using them both. Then you add them to the batch per instructions per gallon. This will kill the yeast. It'll inhibit yeast fermentation and reproduction, so that when your soda or your cider because this is true for sodas too, actually. But for your cider, when that comes back to room temperature, that yeast won't re-ferment the sugar that's in there. So that's why most sodas do have potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, things like that in them. They are preservatives to prevent re-fermentation of those sugars in the bottle that could cause bottle explosions, which could, as a result, cause injuries too. So making cider from scratch is definitely a lot more difficult. I mean, it's about as difficult as making all grain beer, because of the apple selection, the fact that you typically have to, I mean, you got to clean the apples, you got to crush them, and then you have to press them. You can't press apples without crushing them first. So, and you can't really make a good cider without pressing them. There have been some kind of, I call them faux ciders, where people just like mash a bunch of apples, put it in some hot water, let it kind of steep, and then add sugars. And that's, I mean, that's okay. It'll make a drinkable drink, but that's not real cider. That's not how to make really good cider. If you want to make really good quality cider, it's all in the apple choice. Unfortunately, a lot of these apples aren't available to the regular kind of public market. Well, let me get to that in a second. First, I want to get through the apples you're going to need. You're going to need apples with a lot of sugar to encourage fermentation, and you're also going to need apples that will add specific levels of acid and tannins. No single apple variety has all of these things in it, so you may need to blend these different apples to get the best results. Most apple varieties are broken down into 3 groups: sweet, sharp, and bitter. The sweet apples are going to be the apples with a high sugar content to make your cider sweet, but they're going to need partners from the other groups. For your beer makers, think of the sweet apples as your base malt. This is your base malt for your fermentables, for your alcohol, and your base flavor. These can vary. These are more common apples you can find in the stores: Golden Delicious, Fuji, Gala, Red Delicious, Jonah Gold, etc. So these are more common, but if you use 100% of these apples, it'll make a good cider, but it's going to miss some of those acids and tannins that are really pleasing on the tongue when you're drinking it. You know, that little bit of sharpness, or that little bit of tartness. So you can complement that, and usually in ciders, these apples make up 50 to 75% of the base, the sweet apples. The next will be the sharp apples, which typically will be about 35% or so of the cider. And the tartness, these tart apples will have higher acid levels, lower sugar levels. So they give you a little balance. These would be like Macintosh apples, Gravenstein apples. Wine sap apples are probably one of the best in my opinion. Wine sap and Gravenstein are the best I've found. I know Whole Foods does sell Gravenstein, 100% Gravenstein juice in the glass jars sometimes, when it's in season, of course. Liberty apples, and then you're going to need the third apple, bittersweet, which are usually anywhere from 5 to 15% of the final product. They're going to be like crab apples, Cortland's, Newtown's, Porter's Perfection, and a few others that you've probably never heard of them because they are quite rare. And I was saying, you're not going to typically find all of these apples in a lot of grocery stores or even at your local farmer's market. But if you do grow your own, and this depends on the region of the country you're in as well. If you live in the Northwest, you're pretty lucky. You have a lot of apple selections. If you do grow your own apples, or if you know someone who does, or you're willing to pay a premium price for true cider apples, because you can get them online. A lot of these apples did, some cider apples went extinct, so they're over the past couple hundred years, and because they've been bred more for the sweetness and flavor. And it's funny to think, but the rule of thumb kind of is, if the apple doesn't taste very good to eat, it'll probably make a really good cider. I know that sounds strange, but that's kind of just how it's been. So doing the edible apples as 100% will make a good cider, but not as good as if you make a good blend. And if you can't get any of these apples, typically just like apples meant for baking can supplement them with the sweet apples you're using, because they do have a little higher acid content, and a good amount of sugar content as well. And like I was saying, making it from scratch requires an apple crusher, a press, and a lot of labor. And it can be very difficult, but it is a rewarding process. Our apple concentrates are already made from really great Northwest apples, and it makes a really great cider base. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't experiment with different juices or concentrates, or what have you, if you'd like. You can even crush up some apples and put it in there, kind of like a grain steep, except it would go right into your fermentation and secondary, and let the sugars kind of munch on the acids in those apples and on the skins. A lot of different things you can do with ciders. Let's get here on some questions. Mini Yoda says, same fermenting temps as what the yeast packet recommends. What if fermenting at 72-ish? Yeah, stick with the recommended temperatures. You definitely want to kind of stay on the lower end, just like beer. Keep it the same as you would your regular Mr.Beer kits. If you brew a little bit warmer, it could promote a little more yeasty flavors, which in beer you wouldn't be able to taste as much, but in cider you can. Not seeing it for sale on your site. Am I missing it? Are you referring to the keg? The keg isn't available by itself on the site, but you can give us a call and we will sell you one. Same price as the brown keg. So, is there a range for OG and FG? It's going to be very similar to beer, though there are some hard ciders that border more on wines, and in fact some of them are even still wines. Basically, they're not carbonated and they're up to like 10-15% alcohol, so that's an option too. You know, you get a really nice high gravity of like 1.120 or something, and you can make a really nice, like really hard, like imperial apple cider that's carbonated, or you can make a still cider, which would be more like an apple wine. Also I want to talk a little bit about malolactic conversion. So this is some more super advanced stuff, but it will happen naturally in most ciders and wines, especially apple wines. So apple skins contain a lot of malic acid, whereas, like, you know, citrus has citric acid. Tartaric acid is typically found in grapes. So malic acid can be a very, very sharp kind of acidity on your tongue, so it can be a little too tart. So a malolactic conversion is when a lactic bacteria such as Oniococcus odiepi, I think, odeni, something like that. Forgive me, but it's a type of lacto culture that's naturally occurring on a lot of fruits, and it will convert that lactic acid into malic acid, which is going to be a softer, more rounded kind of flavor. Now, this can cause kind of buttery flavors too, but depending on the type of cider you're making, that can be acceptable. But I'm not going to get into ML conversion too much. I just want to let you know it is another advanced technique to change the acidity in your cider. You can either hope that it does an ML conversion and hope that bacteria is on the fruit, or you can actually go to a homebrew shop, buy that particular ML bacteria is what they call it, and you can inoculate it yourself. You got to be sure you are using a yeast that is tolerable of that. So typically you'll want to let fermentation be complete after 7 days, then add that culture and allow it to do the ML conversion. Some people call it a malolactic fermentation, but it's not technically a fermentation. It's a chemical conversion of malic acid into lactic acid caused by a bacteria. Anyway, that's some pretty cool stuff I thought you guys should know. Last time I checked the site, there's only a few recipes for cider. Will you guys release some more in the future? Yeah, we will. We've been really focusing on the beer and on the partial mash and such. I've been thinking about maybe putting my apple pie cider on there, you know, maybe have a little grain steep in there. That's interesting for a cider. But we do have some in our archives, and if you go to our solutions page, we have a whole bunch of archived ciders there. That's usually found on our help desk on our website. And if you're looking for a particular cider, or if you can't find it, or you want ideas, you can always email in and I'll help you, put together something that you'd like to make. Yeah, sometimes we do retire. We do retire recipes. They don't perform very well, or you know, we just want to have everything a little bit more streamlined. So we don't want to have like 10,000 recipes with like 8,000 of them nobody's buying. All right. So I think that's almost it here. Do you guys have any more questions? I know I kind of went over a lot in a short period of time. So there's still a lot. I mean, you can go over with cider. It's pretty easy to make. I mean, it can be easier than beer. It can be more complicated than beer. I mean, if you're starting to really get into those artisanal ciders with the heirloom apples and things like that, and but trust me, if you do get into that, it is so rewarding, and some of those ciders are just absolutely incredible, and they blow Angry Orchard and all those other guys completely out of the water. But they are expensive. Yeah, and if you guys do go to our forums, I recommend signing up. If you scroll down to the community part below, go on there, sign on, peruse the forums. They're talking about a recipe spreadsheet Midi Yoda had put up, and it is in our forums. You can go I would just go in there and message him in the forums, because they can't actually add links to the chat yet. But there's a recipe database there. But again, if you are looking for a particular recipe, let us know. We'll try to look it up, or we'll come up with one for you. All right, and we will be back next week. If you guys don't know, if you guys didn't catch us last week, we're only going to be doing Tuesdays and Wednesdays now instead of Thursdays. We dropped the Thursday off. We want to, you know, we're trying not to run out of content too fast, and we want to kind of have a little bit more quality programming, and so we can focus on 2 episodes instead of 3 episodes per week. Tim is doing the Tuesday episode, which is a beginner, and that's always going to be a Mr.Beer kit, a Mr.Beer recipe, and the Wednesday show is going to be advanced. So, well, Tim's show is going to be beginner and intermediate, because he's going to be doing grain steeps and things like that. Wednesday show is going to be advanced. I might also do some Mr.Beer kits, especially ones that we might be featuring that I really want to brew and show you guys, you know, tips or tricks on it or something like that. But for the most part, the advanced show is going to have a lot of really good advanced information, but it's always going to be still targeted to all of the beginners, so that they can kind of, you know, see what's in store for them in the future, things that they can kind of strive for and attain to. So I want to thank you guys for joining us today, and we will see you this time again on Tuesday. Tim will be back with another beginner intermediate show, and I will see you guys again Wednesday, and I'll see you forum guys on the forums. Cheers.